In this video, we're going to be looking at the imperfect, known as the narrative past tense. In the German curriculum where I teach, we learn the present perfect tense first in German 2 and the imperfect second in German 3. I will be using examples of the perfect throughout this lesson and referring to it with the understanding that my students who would be using this video have already learned the perfect, the present perfect tense. There are three essential questions that we'll be exploring throughout this lesson. When do I use the narrative past tense? How do I use the narrative past tense? And that's always the longest part, is the how. And what is the difference between the simple past, or the narrative past tense, and the present perfect tense? Los. So here are some examples that I found of the simple past tense or narrative past tense. Ich kam, ich sah, ich vergaß, was ich wollte. Ich kam, ich sah, ich ging früher nach Hause, weil dort keine coolen Leute waren. And my favorite, als ich sagte, ich sei normal, habe ich vielleicht etwas übertrieben. All right, so let's really get into this lesson now. The first thing you need to understand is that in the German language, there are two past tenses that are used on a regular basis, the perfect and the imperfect. You previously learned the perfect, which is the present perfect tense, and in this lesson, we're going to be really looking at then the imperfect. These two tenses are not interchangeable. There is a correct time to use each one, and it's essential that you understand the correct time and use them in the correct situations. The perfect, which is called the present perfect tense, also known as the conversational past, is the form we use in conversations. This is a spoken past tense. Although we do written practice with all of these things, as you move forward in your German studies and increase your German abilities, the perfect would always be used in conversations. This is the tense you have already learned, where we use haben or sein as the helping verb, and we had our past participle, which typically started with the g at the end of our sentence. The imperfect or Präteritum, it's called both of those things depending on which textbook you're looking at, which website you go to, Imperfekt and Präteritum. This is the narrative past tense, which is also known as the simple past, and it is a written tense mainly used in narratives and storytelling. Narrative past tense is the more descriptive to help you remember narrative, narrating, you're writing a narrative. But the great thing about this is also the simple past tense, and it is much easier than the present perfect tense. So let's take a look and compare the perfect and the imperfect a little before we go any further. This first sentence, she played soccer. We have one way to say that in English, spoken or written. It's always going to be she played soccer. The two sentences that you see here, the perfect, sie hat Fußball gespielt, and the imperfect, sie spielte Fußball. Both of those would translate as she played soccer, but they have their correct time and place for use. Sie hat Fußball gespielt would be in a conversation. Sie spielte Fußball would be in writing. Again, both of these sentences mean she played soccer. We just have to know, am I saying this sentence or am I writing this sentence? Second example of this, I saw that. Perfekt, ich habe das gesehen. Imperfekt, ich sah das. So our first example, ich habe das gesehen, would be our spoken past tense. Ich sah das would be a written past tense. So in the narrative past tense, regular and irregular verbs can be a little tricky for people to get. Unlike the present perfect tense, there's no real rule to which verbs are regular and which verbs are irregular in the narrative past tense. As we go through this lesson and practice, you really will need to look them up on Leo and begin memorizing them over time and through practice and repetition. That's going to be the key, is the practice and repetition to eventually be memorizing these verb forms. Now let's take a look at how the narrative past works with regular verbs. The first thing you'll need to do is discover the stem of the verb. Think back, way back in conjugation. How do we get the stem of the verb? If we have, for example, spielen, the stem of the verb is spiel. So we remove the en ending. So to change our regular verbs in the narrative past, you'll start with the stem of the verb, and then you're going to use these endings. So if we have ich as our subject, we'll add a te to that stem. So we would have ich spielte. If we have du as our subject, we add test, spieltest. RCS would be a ta, spielte. You'll notice that your ich and your RCS forms are exactly the same in the narrative past tense. Kind of like with modal verbs, our ich and our RCS were always the same. Our wir, we add ten, ten, so spielten. Ihr, we add tet, spieltet. And sie, we add ten, so spielten. And these are the endings that we use on any regular verb in the narrative past tense. And this is how it would look. So I just talked you through it, but let's take a look for my visual learners on how that looks in the imperfect, also known as the Präteritum. With that same verb, spielen, to play, our stem is spiel. We drop the en, and these are the forms that we get. So ich spielte, I played. Du spieltest, you played. Sie spielte, he, she, or it played. Wir spielten, we played. Ihr spieltet, you, plural, played. And sie or sie spielten, so you formal or they played. So for any verb, and I'm going to show you on Leo towards the end of this lesson how to see if it is a regular or irregular verb. If it's a regular verb, we add these endings to the stem and you have the narrative past tense form. There are verbs that you have to have an extra step, which is adding an E between the stem and the correct ending. And really make note of these, highlight this in your notes. There's not a lot of them at this point in our vocabulary brains for German, but if you do have a verb stem that ends in a T, a D, a CHN, an FN, a GN, or a TM, an extra E is inserted between the stem and the correct ending. A main verb that we've had before that would work this way is arbeiten, to work. Our stem is arbeit, and we have to put an E back in there. You can see it just makes it flow a little better. So ich arbeitete, it almost sounds like we're stuttering. Ich arbeitete, du arbeitetest, arbeitete, wir arbeiteten, ihr arbeitetet, and sie arbeiteten. So we add that E back in. A couple common verbs that are listed down here would be arbeiten, kosten, regnen. So here we see that GN, es regnete gestern. It rained yesterday. So we have to add this E in if we have any of these letters or combinations of letters at our stem. So take a look at these. Maybe pause the video and see if you can. I'm telling you that these are regular verbs. See if you can add the proper endings as we take a look at each of these sentences. So ich spiele Fußball becomes ich spielte Fußball. And we go from I play soccer to I played soccer. Macht die Arbeit becomes machte die Arbeit. He does the work. He did the work. Wir tanzen in der Disco changes to wir tanzten in der Disco. So we dance in the dance club or we danced in the dance club. Meine Mutter besucht sie becomes meine Mutter besuchte sie. My mother visits her. My mother visited her. So going from the present tense to the narrative past tense, which is also why it's called the simple past, we just have to change our verb form. No other word order change. We don't have our helping verb and our "ga" that gets sent to the end of the sentence. Our verb goes in its normal place in our new narrative past tense verb form. Now let's take a look at irregular verbs, and there are a lot of them. Again, practice and repetition is how you're going to get these forms down. To change an irregular verb to the narrative past, you will start with the irregular past tense stem, and I'm going to show you how to find those, and then you add these endings. If it's ich or RZS, you actually don't add an ending at all. It just stays the stem that you would look up and find on Leo, for example, and you don't have to do anything else to it if it's ich or RZS. For all of the others, these are our normal present tense conjugation endings, just added to an irregular past tense stem. So ich takes no ending, du takes an ST ending, RZS, no ending, wir gets an EN, ihr gets a T, and Z gets an EN. And let's take a look at what that would look like. If we have the verb kommen, for example, to come, this is an irregular verb in the narrative past tense. And the stem is kam. For ich, I don't add an ending of any kind, so ich kam, I came. Du kamst, you came. RZS kam, he, she, or it came. Wir kamen, we came. Ihr kamt, you plural came. And Z kamen, you formal or they came. So important again to note and remember that ich and RZS take no endings at all. So when you look these up on Leo and it's ich or RZS, you are done. You just insert it into your sentence and no additional endings required. There are some patterns that we're going to look at with irregular verbs in the narrative past tense. These aren't rules, they are patterns, and we're going to look at some examples of these and help you become familiar with some of the irregular verbs that we're going to be looking at and working with in the narrative past tense. So these, it's all about the vowels. If we had an A in our original verb, often the A changes to a U in the narrative past tense. I'm going to be saying often and some of the time a lot here because these are not always, these are just a lot of the time rules. If our verb originally had an E, oftentimes it changes to an A in the narrative past tense. If our original verb had an EI, we get a vowel switch and it becomes IE in the narrative past tense. If we had an I in our original verb, I's often change to A's. And if we have an IE, those often change to an O in the narrative past tense. And now I want to take a look at some of these patterns of vowel changes. So the first pattern that I had listed on the previous page was A changing to U. And here are some of the really most common German verbs that you've already learned that do this. So the infinitive fahren becomes fuhr, A to U. Schlagen, schlug, tragen, trug, and waschen, wusch. If we look at the vowel change of an E to an A, here are some of the common verbs that you would know at this point. Essen becomes aß, geben, gab, helfen, half, lesen, las, sehen, sah. And of course, I do recommend pausing the video and writing down these common verb forms as you're seeing them here to have them in your notes. The next vowel change is an EI changing and switching around to become an IE. Some of the common verbs that we've seen before. Bleiben becomes blieb, heißen, hieß, schreiben, schrieb, and steigen, stieg. The next vowel change pattern, I changing to an A. Several verbs that we've learned at this point that do this. Beginnen becomes begann. Bringen, brachte. Finden, fand. Schwimmen, schwamm. Sitzen, saß. And trinken, trank. And you will notice that sitzen is really irregular and the Z even went away. The T and the Z went away from sitzen to become saß. Our next vowel change, IE, changing to O. Some of the verbs that we've seen before. Fliegen becomes flog, schießen, schoss, und verlieren, verlor. So with these irregular verbs, where you have to remember that ich and er, sie, es take no additional ending. They are the irregular stems that we've looked at. And then we have the normal conjugation endings on our other ones. See if you can pause the video and figure each of these out before I say them. Ich gehe in die Stadt would change to ich ging in die Stadt. Er isst eine Bratwurst becomes er aß eine Bratwurst. Wir fahren in die Schweiz becomes wir fuhren in die Schweiz. Und meine Schwester liest ein Buch becomes meine Schwester las ein Buch. The last thing I want to look at is how to find these on leo.org, which is the recommended site that I have my students become familiar with in my class. So as I stated, there's no rule as to whether or not a verb is regular or irregular in the imperfect Präteritum. You need to learn how to look them up and then memorize them with use. So if we go to www.leo.org, my favorite dictionary site with also all of these great grammar tools, this is what we would do. So you are going to enter the verb you are looking for in the search bar, just like you do if you're looking up for a translation. So I entered gehen here. Next to the German word, you will see the imperfect followed by the perfect. You've probably noticed these before. You've probably seen the gegangen and didn't really know what this ging was and just ignored it. But this is our stem that we would be using in the narrative past tense. If you open up the table, you will see Präteritum. Leo uses the word Präteritum. Imperfect and Präteritum are interchangeable. Just depends on which site you are looking at. So knowing for Leo that Leo uses the word Präteritum. When you open that table, you will see Präteritum, and here's my fully conjugated gehen in the narrative past tense. So I would see ich ging, du gingst, er, sie, es ging, wir gingen, ihr gingt, and sie, the formal Z capitalized, gingen. Okay, so that is the narrative past tense. And with this one, it's just really important to get in that practice and repetition. Doing these over and over and over are going to help you become more comfortable with the verb forms, and you'll start to memorize them through that practice and repetition. As always, if you have questions, please be sure to reach out to me, email me, and I am happy to help. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss.
Tschüss von Frau Katzen und Merle. Tschüss alle.